Hi everyone, it's Janet with SugarShine Designs. I'm here today with two cards using the new Art Impressions Gull Friends set. I will be using Zig Clean Color markers for the coloring today, and I'll show you how I colored these images up as well as put these cards together for you. If you have any questions about the supplies or want to pick up the stamp set, I've got everything included in my video description for you. Just follow the links. Alright, let's get started coloring these images with my Zig Clean Color markers. So here are the images for the first card I'm going to do. This is for the Slimline Birthday card. And all of these gulls are really easy to color. I just used the light gray brush marker and just watered that out, spread the color around, and then went in here and there, added some more shadowing if I felt I needed it. And for me, I like to use a wet brush for moving color around when I'm using the clear color brush markers. I just feel like it has a little bit more control for me. I can control how much water I need and how much spread I need to have. When I use water brushes themselves, I have some trouble with them because it's the same flow all the time, and I don't always want as much as at least my brush marker does. So anyway, I have just taken to using a number 3 round brush for my blending, and it works really well for me. Now the beaks here are done with bright yellow and orange, and then the legs are also done with orange. The balloon, I'm using carmine red and just spreading that color out, then going back in and adding a little bit more shadow to get a little more round effect. And then I'm using cobalt blue, Persian blue, and carmine red for the packages in the beak of this particular gull. And there's quite a bit of little tiny details in this, and I also added some red polka dots to some of the packages, both red and blue. And again, that particular blue is the Persian blue. It's the darker color. I used a tiny bit of light violet too in those packages. Then for his hat, I'm using the cobalt blue, and I'm going to spread that out to get some shading in there. I put some carmine red in the tassels at the end of his hat, and that pretty much finishes him up. Now here's the second one. I had already colored him with the gray using the same technique, and then I came back with the cobalt blue for the balloon that's in his mouth. Behind that there's another balloon that just barely shows up, and that I'm using the light violet for. For this guy's hat, I'm using the light violet as well. And I did his tassel on the top, or his puff on the top, in the same color. Next up is the gull that's holding the birthday cake in his beak, and this one is using the Persian blue, and I'm using that on the icing for this cake. Using just water and brush strokes, I'm able to get a pretty nice little shading technique going on here. You don't need a lot of colors. One color like this will allow you to get some shading, and if you need to remove some color to get a little more highlight, you can do that too with a clean brush. Just dab it onto the color and then clean the brush off on something. I usually use my skin and that will lighten it up as well, so it's just a matter of kind of picking it up. Now I use cobalt blue and pink to put stripes on the candles, and then I used yellow for the candle flames themselves. And then I finally used a little bit of light gray on that cake just to give it a little bit dimension, because all things, even white things, have some color or shading to them. Next, I'm going to color up some of the little accessories, like this kite. There's a cute beach ball, there's a couple shells, and there's a single small gull, more of a traditional gull, as you see there. So I used May green and the carmine red in this example. Same technique, adding a little bit where I want the shadow and then spreading that color out. Another tip I'd like to give you while I'm doing this is that I prefer to use Strathmore Bristol papers, and particularly the kind that is vellum. A lot of artists will show and like to use the Bristol Smooth, but I find that that kind of breaks up too easily. I probably use my brush more than average or something, because the Bristol Smooth tends to break up. I get little pieces coming off or balling up, and I find with the vellum it will hold the water really well. It doesn't spread as badly either. It tends to stay where I put it, and it does not break up with the amount of water or brush strokes or both that I apply. So I've really, I learned that by mistake. I got Bristol Vellum one time instead of Smooth and discovered that I liked it a lot better. So again, one of those happy accidents sort of things. Now the shells that I'm making here, I'm using a combination of oatmeal, bright yellow, orange, and just picking out colors I think would be good to add some more dimension. The Starship has the orange and bright yellow, I believe. And then finally I'm going to show you quickly doing this little gull. Very simple, a little bit of orange for his feet and some light gray again like the other gulls, and just bringing that out to add some more shading and dimension to him. Or her. Probably is a female, right? I don't know. It seems like I always want to give it a male or female aspect when I talk about these images, or any images really. In any case, this is the next image for the other card I'm going to do. It's part of the set as well. It has 5 of these gulls, and I do the grays exactly the same. So I'm not going to show you all of that. Then I use a little bit of the orange for the legs again. These have very knobby little legs. Every one of these guys has a knob, so I came back in with the orange and just put a darker bit of orange in those knobby areas to make their legs look a little more interesting. Then I'm using the Carmine Red on the Lifesaver here. Same thing as before, just adding it in one area and bringing it up and out with my water brush. Or really, not a water brush, but a brush with water. So this video is a little longer than typical for me, mainly because I'm showing all of my coloring. Even though I've sped this up quite a bit, it still is taking a good while to get through it all, and there's a lot of images to color. I typically don't show this because I'm such a slow colorist that it just it feels like to me it would be boring. But I've done it this time, and I would love to know what you think. If you don't like it, please tell me that as well. You may not feel like you need to see me color these images in the future, and I'm just trying to figure out if it's something you want to see or not see. So again, a comment about this would be so appreciated. So getting back to the images here, this is so cute because there's so many neat little details. Like this hat is a French fry box with fries hanging up, you know, on the top of it like a feather. And then we've got the cute little bag. This one's got some funky sunglasses. There's the pail for the hat, the Lifesaver for a necklace, and also flip-flop for a necklace. Lots of cute details. So here are all the images after I've gotten done coloring them, and now it's time to cut them out with the dies that are included conveniently with this set. What I like to do is I will cut shapes out with the dies, and then I'll use those shapes to help me determine where I'm going to place my dies when I'm actually cutting out my real images. So this creates kind of a little hole that you can drop your die into, and by drop I mean drop, because it will feel like it's dropping into that hole and you'll know it's in the right place. Just use some washi tape to secure everything and stop potential movement, and you should get really excellent die cuts from your stamped images. And I just wanted to show you one on how I did that right there. So here are all of the images now cut, as well as colored of course, and they're ready to work with. I'm going to start by making the Slimline card today. We're going to use again some of the Bristol vellum for the card panel. This panel is 8 1/4 by 3 1/4, and I started by using a ruler to kind of put little dots for 6 different colors of Distress Oxide ink. I'll explain more about that in a minute. Now I'm going to mask the bottom off with some blue painter's tape because I'm going to use the Distress Oxide, but I want it to have a solid, straight and clean line at the end. And that's because I'm going to put my sentiment below it. I'm using a selection of oxide inks, distressed oxide inks here. The first one was Picked Raspberry, and the next one I'm going to use is the Carved Pumpkin. And as I go along, I'm going to erase the little dot I placed. And the reason that I do this is because if I don't control myself with that little dot, it's kind of more of a mental thing, but it stops me from going too far to the right and left. Otherwise, I sort of get out of control. And so it's a mental game that I'm using on myself to stop me from going too far, which is something you may or may not need to do with yourself. But after I apply each color, now this one is Cracked Pistachio, I go back with the previous color, in this case Squeezed Lemonade, and blend that edge. And then I'll start with the next color, erasing that pencil mark again first. So this color is Mermaid Lagoon. I really like this blue. It's so pretty. And I'll go back again with the the Cracked Pistachio. And then the final color I'm going to use is Chipped Sapphire after this, which is a very, very dark blue. So we'll bring this out. Now I like the oxide inks better for blending than I do the distress inks. But there are certain times that I do like the distressed inks better because the oxide inks definitely do have sort of a chalky type finish sometimes. And that's not always preferred for the particular project you might be working on. But in this case, the oxides work quite nicely for me. But I am going to use some distress ink in the next card rather than the oxide. Alright, so I took off the tape, the masking tape, but I really did so too soon because I am going to take some of this Delusions shimmer spray. Its color is Pure Sunshine, which is a great name for it. Now instead of spraying, I prefer to splatter it this way with a brush off of a acrylic block because you get more organic dots and shapes and splatters than you do when you just spray it out of the bottle. It tends to be too fine, and I prefer a more organic, like I say, dot pattern that you get from splattering. And now I've stamped the sentiment that's included in the set and the anchor. I'm also putting in these silhouettes of additional birds flying in the background. And for this, I'm using some black onyx ink. And it really shows up nicely against all these beautiful colors that I've used for the background. Now I'm going to apply some glue, and I'm going to put this down on my 8.5 by 3.5 sized card base that I made. I also trimmed the piece that I had colored on. I think I mentioned before that I had a 4.25 by 3.25 size, but it actually was the full 8.5 by 3.5, and then I trimmed off the edges so I could get rid of some of those inky edges that you tend to get when you're ink blending. And now I'm adding those 3 birthday images that we colored up, and I've put foam tape behind them. I probably should have moved this guy a little bit more inward, but it turned out okay. And then I've got that little tiny gull that I'm going to put in between, and some other accessories to sort of fill up the space between these characters. Here is a beach ball that I'm putting in, and then I have a starfish that I have on some foam tape so that it sits above the ball and adds a little more dimension. And then finally I have one of those little kites that I'm going to put into the background as well. And that finishes up this one. I really like the clean, nice look of it. All right, we're going to move on to number 2. This is an A2 size card. This panel is a full A2 size, 4.25 by 5.5, because I will trim it down a bit. I'm going to start by masking off the bottom portion of it, and then I'm going to use a cutting plate from my Big Shot as a stamping acrylic block here. A lot of times when I do a big background like this, I will actually put the paper down on top of the stamp and like use a brayer to get a good impression. This time I'm doing a little bit opposite because I do want to mask off a section. I thought it would be easier to just do it this way. This isn't ideal to do in my MISTI like I normally would like to do, so using the cutting plate works pretty well for handling this large stamp, because most of us are not going to have acrylic blocks big enough to handle this size, but the cutting plate is perfect. It sticks well and works like a charm. Alright, so now that I've gotten the Versamark watermark ink on there, I am adding the white embossing powder. And somehow or another, I completely missed kind of a rectangle shape there at the bottom. I wasn't too worried about it, however, because I wanted the edge of this wavy stamp to be uneven anyway. I just didn't really expect it to be that much different. You know, in a lot of other times, maybe I'd have to throw this out, but I'm working with it, and it actually turned out really well. I'm going to use some plain distress ink now for the sand. I've got a combination of antique linen and tea dye ink. The antique linen is the lighter color, and then I'm using the tea dye to shadow and shade it, especially toward the bottom. You'll see at the very end that I'm using that tea dye at the bottom to get more shadow. Really, in the end, this is going to be almost entirely covered up by sand embossing powder, but this way you've got a nice good brown underneath, so that if some embossing powder doesn't cover completely, you're not going to see white peeking through. And so this is a way to handle any problem that you might find with that. So then I'm going to next work on the embossed waves, and I've used 3 colors here. There is Mermaid Lagoon and Tumbled Glass, and then the Chipped Sapphire, just to get some different colorations and shading. And that chipped sapphire is a bit more purple, but if mixed in with those other 2 blues, really is quite pretty. Once that's done, I'm just going to rub off the excess ink from the top or the surface of the white embossing powder that I did there, so you get a nice white peeking through. Now I'm going to use watermark ink in the sand area. It was just easier to pull one of the mini cubes I have from Hero Arts for that, so that I could just apply it directly from the ink cube. And then on top of that is the Hero Arts sand embossing powder. I don't use this powder all that often, but when I do for certain beach scenes, it's just fabulous. If you don't have this in your crafting collection, you should try to get it, because it's so fun to work with. And there are different companies that produce it. This one's from Hero Arts, but I think all the major companies do produce them of sand. So check that out. Once this is melted, you get a nice graduation of color of dark and light browns and some golds in there, and it really does look a lot like sand. It's kind of crazy. So after I did this, I decided that I wanted to get the edge a little bit less sharp looking where the sand is in some places. So I just took another domed sponge and a mini blending tool, coated that with some watermark ink, and I'm just applying it around the edges where I want the sand to be just a little bit less sharp looking. Honestly, again, in the end, because you're placing the characters in this area, the sharp edges are not going to show so much, but I still wanted to just soften it up a little bit. And anywhere I didn't want it that it stuck, I just rubbed off with my fingers and then applied the heat to melt it all again. Next, I'm going to put some more of those silhouetted birds flying in the background up here. And you know, depending on your view of this, you could think it's either kind of a very modern looking sky or it's waves. Of course, when I added the birds, it kind of gives you an indication of sky. Next, I'm adding a sun that I made out of the stitch circle dies. I took a small one and then added some strips radiating out from the middle to form a sun, and this is what I stamped the sentiment on. Gulls just want to have fun. Isn't that cute? I think it's super cute. And then I will just trim off the edges of any of those rays that stick beyond the edge of my card panel here. Getting closer to being done, the next step is to apply with foam tape my selection of 5 little gulls here. They are so stinking cute. Love it. And when you're putting it on the sand, it just looks so good. Alright, so in go a few more accessories like that kite. We've got a couple more shells, and then I'm going to place the final sentiment. This is a flag type banner, and I used a little bit of the watermark ink and embossing powder just to do the edges of it. I inked the edges of the flag too with some black ink to make it stand out a bit more, and added that to the card front with glue. Finally, I'm going to add a couple more shells. The first one goes directly onto the card panel. Then I've got a second starfish that is lifted on a tiny bit of foam tape for dimension. And now this is ready to go on my card base, and the card will be done. I don't feel like there's anything else needed here. There's a lot of texture, a lot of color. It looks great. So that will do it for me today. I hope you enjoyed these 2 cards. If you did, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, and do subscribe if you haven't already. And please tell me if you like seeing the coloring or not. That will help me a lot to know what I should do in the future. Have a great day, everyone. I'll be back soon with another video.